James Carter stepped out of the taxi and took a slow, deep breath as the warm air of the afternoon touched his face. The airport was busy as usual. People hurried past with rolling suitcases, backpacks, and coffee cups in their hands. Some wore excited smiles as they prepared to travel. Others looked tired from long flights. James walked calmly, not rushing. He had spent most of his life moving through crowded places like this. Airports didn't make him nervous. If anything, they felt like part of his second home. He wore a plain navy blue jacket, a gray t-shirt, and comfortable jeans. Nothing in his clothes showed that he was one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the country. That was how he preferred it. After years of serving in high-pressure missions, James had learned the value of moving quietly. Sometimes the strongest people were the ones no one noticed. In his small black duffel bag were only two things that mattered most: his credentials and his service badge. James had just finished a long, quiet assignment in another city. It had been intense not because of danger, but because of the delicate nature of the work. Now, on his way back to Washington, D.C., he felt a calm sense of relief. He was looking forward to going home, resting for a few hours, and then heading into the office the next day to prepare for the upcoming leadership briefing. He had a lot of responsibilities, but at this moment, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the ordinary rhythm of the airport. As he entered the terminal, his eyes quickly scanned the crowd. It was a habit he could never turn off. Years of training had made him observant. He noticed the man at the newspaper stand counting change twice, a young woman nervously looking at her phone near the gate signs, and a couple trying to control their laughing toddler. Nothing seemed unusual. It was just another ordinary travel day. James walked toward the check-in counter. He carried no luggage except his small duffel. The woman at the counter smiled politely. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your ID?" she asked. James returned the smile, reached into his jacket, and handed her his government identification card. She checked it, typed a few things into her computer, and then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. You're all set. Gate C4. Have a safe flight." "Thank you," he replied warmly. He picked up his bag and moved toward the security area. He walked with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. He wasn't in a hurry. He had arrived early, as he always did. Years in law enforcement had taught him that being early meant being prepared. As he walked, a few people glanced at him, but quickly looked away. There was nothing about him that drew attention. That was exactly how he liked it. James was proud of his career, but he never needed people to know who he was. Respect, in his view, came not from showing power, but from carrying it quietly. In his pocket, James felt the familiar weight of his official badge. It was smooth and solid, a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. He had started his career as a young officer more than 20 years ago, walking the streets of his hometown with a sense of duty and hope. Over the years, through dedication, sleepless nights, and careful leadership, he had risen through the ranks. Now he was not just a senior officer, he was the top marshal in the entire country. People at the highest levels of government trusted his judgment. But here, at this airport, he was just another traveler. As he stood in the line leading to the security checkpoint, James pulled out his boarding pass and ID. The line moved slowly, but he didn't mind. He had learned patience early in his career. It was one of the quiet strengths that separated calm professionals from those who rushed into mistakes. He noticed the soft sound of rolling suitcases, the beeping of scanners, the chatter of children asking questions their parents couldn't quite answer. Everything blended together into a kind of airport music, a rhythm that told him everything was normal. In front of him stood an older couple, chatting softly about their grandchildren. Behind him, a young man in a business suit tapped on his phone, clearly worried about an upcoming meeting. To James, this mix of people, old, young, professional, casual, was one of the beautiful things about public spaces. Everyone came from different places, but in that line, everyone was equal. Everyone had to wait. Everyone had to follow the same process. James adjusted his jacket slightly. He didn't like to attract attention, but he always stayed aware of his surroundings. He noticed a uniformed officer at a distance near one of the entrances. The officer seemed to be scanning the crowd, which was normal for airport security. James understood that better than anyone else. Keeping airports safe required sharp eyes and alert minds. He gave a small nod to himself, approving of the officer's focus, and turned his attention back to the line. As he moved forward step by step, James thought about his upcoming meeting in Washington. He was expected to lead a discussion about new training programs for young officers across the country. For years, he had worked to make sure law enforcement was not just about authority, but about responsibility. He believed officers should understand the communities they served. They should learn to listen, to observe, and to treat people with fairness and respect. That belief had guided his entire career. When he reached the front of the line, he handed his ID to the transportation security officer. The man glanced at it, then back at James, then at the boarding pass. He smiled. "Thank you, sir. You're good to go." James gave a polite nod and stepped forward. He placed his duffel bag on the conveyor belt, slipped off his watch, and stepped through the metal detector. The machine remained silent. He always traveled light. Once through, James collected his bag and belongings. He checked everything carefully and walked toward the seating area near Gate C4. He found an empty seat by the window. Outside, planes rolled slowly along the runway, their engines humming. He loved this part of travel, the quiet moments before boarding. It gave him time to reflect, to breathe, and to reset. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his colleague in Washington. "Safe travels, boss. Big week ahead." James smiled. His team trusted him, and he trusted them. He had worked hard to build that bond. Leadership to him wasn't about standing above people. It was about standing with them. A family with 2 children sat down nearby. The little boy pointed excitedly at the planes outside, asking his father endless questions. The father answered patiently, and James felt a warm feeling in his chest. He loved moments like this, ordinary human moments that reminded him why he did his job. He wanted a world where families could travel, work, and live without fear. A few rows away, he saw the same uniformed officer again, walking slowly, observing. It didn't bother James. He respected good security work. He leaned back in his seat, not realizing that this ordinary moment was about to change dramatically. James didn't know that the next few minutes would become a story told across the nation. He didn't know that the way he carried himself that day, quiet, calm, dignified, would reveal more about leadership than any speech or title ever could. For now, he was just a man waiting for his flight. He glanced at his watch, then out the window again. As the late afternoon sun painted the plains in gold, what he carried in his bag, a badge, an ID, a career built on trust, was invisible to everyone around him. And that was fine. Respect didn't always need to be seen. Sometimes it only needed to be lived. James stood and stretched lightly, deciding to grab a cup of coffee before boarding began. As he walked toward the small cafe near the gate, he passed travelers of every kind. Students with headphones, grandparents carrying gifts, tourists taking pictures of the planes. Each face told a different story. Each person was on a different journey. And James, in his quiet way, was part of that shared moment. He ordered a black coffee, smiled at the barista who handed it to him, and returned to his seat. He liked the warmth of the cup in his hands. It was simple. Real. In his world of careful planning and serious decisions, these small, ordinary details meant everything. He sipped slowly and let his thoughts wander. He thought of his family, of the team waiting for him in D.C., of the young officers he hoped to inspire. He thought of the future, the work still ahead, and the responsibility that came with it. But above all, he felt grateful. To have earned trust, to be part of something bigger than himself, to stand for something good. The gate announcement echoed through the speakers. "Attention passengers for Flight 274 to Washington, D.C. Boarding will begin in 20 minutes. James glanced up. Everything seemed calm, just as it should be. But in the crowd, unnoticed by him, the officer he had seen earlier was watching more closely now. A small misunderstanding was beginning to form. And though James couldn't see it yet, that misunderstanding would soon grow into a moment that would test not only his patience, but the values he had built his entire life on. For now, though he sat quietly, coffee in hand, watching planes move across the sky, calm before the storm, and in that quiet moment everything still felt safe and ordinary. Ames Carter sat near Gate C4 with his coffee in hand, enjoying the quiet moments before the flight. Around him, travelers were settling into their own routines, some scrolling through their phones, others whispering to loved ones or just staring out at the planes. There was a warm golden light filling the terminal from the large glass windows. It made everything feel peaceful. For James, who spent most of his time dealing with serious work, this calm was something rare. A young mother passed by holding her daughter's hand. The little girl smiled shyly at James. He smiled back and she giggled before hiding behind her mother's leg. James always found joy in small moments like this. He had learned long ago that it was often these quiet details that made life meaningful. He had spent years protecting people he would never meet, but seeing them live ordinary lives made it all worth it. But a few rows away, the uniformed airport officer James had noticed earlier was standing with his arms crossed, still scanning the waiting area. His name was Officer Bradley. He was in his early 30s, tall, and carried himself with a kind of rigid seriousness. Bradley had been working at the airport for a few years. He liked order. He liked control. But sometimes his quick judgments led him down the wrong path. Bradley's eyes moved from face to face. Then they paused on James. Something in his mind decided that James seemed different. Not because James was doing anything wrong. He wasn't. He was just sitting, calm and quiet. But Bradley's mind connected dots that didn't actually exist. Maybe it was the way James was watching everything with steady eyes. Maybe it was his plain clothing. Maybe it was simply that Bradley wasn't looking closely enough. He whispered something into his radio, keeping his eyes on James. The response from the other end was calm. "Everything's routine, Bradley. Just keep your post." But Bradley didn't let go of his suspicion so easily. He adjusted his belt and walked slowly toward the seating area. James didn't notice him at first. He was still looking out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky a soft orange. He liked moments like this, between work and rest, between noise and silence. He was thinking about his family. He had promised to call his sister when he landed. He had promised to attend his niece's school event next week. These thoughts made him smile quietly. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Officer Bradley approached. He stood a few feet away, observing James carefully. His eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't see a badge. He didn't see a uniform. And for him, that was enough to let a wrong assumption grow. "Excuse me," Bradley said, his voice firm but not loud. "Sir, can I speak with you for a moment?" James turned his head and looked at the officer. His expression was calm, polite. He had spoken to countless officers in his life. Encounters like this were normal in public spaces, and he had nothing to hide. He gave a small nod. "Of course," James said evenly. Bradley took a small step closer. "Can I see some identification?" James reached for his jacket pocket calmly. "Sure," he said. His voice was steady, his movements slow and respectful. He had no reason to rush. He pulled out his wallet, opened it, and took out his official ID card. He handed it to the officer. Bradley looked at it quickly but didn't really look. He saw the name, but the title didn't sink in. He glanced up at James again. "What brings you here today?" "I'm on my way to Washington," James replied. "Flight in about 15 minutes. Bradley's questions grew a little more pointed. "Business or personal?" "Both," James said with a small smile. "But nothing unusual." Bradley nodded, but there was something stubborn in his eyes. His thoughts were racing. Something inside him kept saying, "He doesn't look like someone who belongs in a high-security area." Of course, this thought had no real reason behind it. But Bradley didn't challenge his own assumption. He let it grow instead. People nearby began to glance their way. It wasn't a loud conversation, but an officer standing over someone always attracted curious eyes. A few passengers whispered to each other. A little boy leaned forward in his chair to watch, but his mother gently pulled him back. James noticed the officer's tone and the way his eyes lingered. He had dealt with this kind of situation before, not at airports necessarily, but in many different settings. Sometimes people made quick judgments based on surface impressions. He had learned to keep calm even when the situation didn't feel fair. "Is everything all right, officer?" James asked kindly. Bradley hesitated. He wanted to say yes and walk away, but a small, stubborn thought inside him said, "I need to check further." So instead of letting the moment pass, he asked, "Can you stand up for me, sir?" James set his coffee down slowly and rose to his feet. He was not upset. He was not frightened. He was simply alert now, aware that this was no longer just a routine question. His height made him look even more confident, and his calmness somehow unsettled Bradley further. "Is there a problem?" James asked again. Bradley didn't answer directly. He gestured toward a nearby area with fewer passengers. "Just step over here for a moment," James followed. He didn't like making a scene, and if stepping aside meant resolving the misunderstanding quickly, then he was fine with that. He knew who he was. He had nothing to prove, but he also understood how quickly small misunderstandings could grow, if not handled carefully. The area near the wall was quieter. Only a few people could hear their conversation now. Bradley spoke into his radio softly, asking for another officer to join him. That small action told James everything. He understood now that this wasn't just casual questioning. Bradley had decided to follow a suspicion that didn't have real ground. James took a deep breath. His voice remained calm, but there was a quiet strength in it. "Officer," he said clearly, "you have my government ID in your hand. If you look closely, you'll see exactly who I am." Bradley glanced down again. He saw the words on the ID, but something in his mind resisted. He wasn't used to dealing with people of James's rank, and part of him didn't believe it could be real. "I just need to verify," Bradley said. "Of course," James replied gently. "Take your time." The other officer arrived a moment later. Her name was Officer Lynn. She was more experienced and carried herself with quiet confidence. When Bradley showed her the ID, she looked at it more carefully than he had. Her eyes widened slightly. She immediately understood the situation. "Bradley," she whispered firmly, "this is serious." Bradley frowned, confused. Lynn stepped closer to James and spoke with polite respect. "Sir, I apologize. May I confirm your credentials through our system?" James nodded. "Of course. Go ahead." Lynn stepped aside to make a quick verification call. Bradley stood there awkwardly, realizing something about the situation was slipping out of his control. Passengers nearby watched the scene with curious eyes, sensing that something important was happening even though no one raised their voice. James kept his hands by his sides, shoulders relaxed. He had been in far more stressful situations than this, but there was a quiet sadness in his chest too, a sadness that came from being misunderstood for no real reason. He had spent his life working to make sure people were treated with fairness, and now here he was standing quietly, while someone else's assumption painted him as suspicious. He didn't let the feeling show on his face. Years of leadership had taught him how to keep calm even when the world around him wasn't. Lynn returned after a few minutes. "Sir, thank you for your patience," she said with a respectful nod. "Everything checks out perfectly." Bradley's face tightened slightly. A part of him wanted to step back, but the silence between them was enough to say everything. James didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply gave a small, steady nod. "Thank you," James said softly. "I appreciate your professionalism." Lynn glanced at Bradley as if to say something without words. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. The passengers who had been watching began to lose interest and return to their own conversations. To them, it was just another short, strange moment at the airport. But to James, it was another quiet reminder of something deeper. He picked up his bag, adjusted his jacket, and started walking back toward his seat. Bradley stood there, frozen for a few seconds, realizing that the man he had doubted so casually was someone far more important than he had guessed. But even more than the title, it was James's grace under pressure that made the moment powerful. As James sat down again, the gate announcement came through the speakers. Boarding would begin soon. He looked out the window once more, the golden light now giving way to soft evening shades. He thought about the conversation. He thought about how quickly misunderstandings can grow if not handled with care. James didn't hold anger in his heart. That was not who he was. But he made a quiet promise to himself. This would not just be another moment forgotten at the airport. It was a sign, an important one, that even good systems need better understanding, better training, and deeper awareness. He finished the last sip of his coffee, put the cup aside, and stood once more when boarding was called. The evening air outside was cool and soft. He walked toward the gate slowly, with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. Behind him, Officer Bradley was still standing near the wall, replaying the encounter in his mind. He didn't know yet how deeply this single moment would stay with him. But for James, the story was only beginning. James Carter walked slowly toward the boarding gate, holding his boarding pass in one hand and his small duffel bag in the other. Around him, passengers were lining up in an orderly line. Some looked tired, some were excited, and a few were too focused on their phones to notice anything else. The calm sound of footsteps mixed with the voice of the gate agent calling out boarding groups. It felt like any other flight boarding, but James could still feel the weight of what had just happened. He didn't let it show on his face, but deep down something in his heart felt heavy. He had experienced many things in his career: long nights, high-pressure decisions, complicated missions. But there was always a different kind of feeling when someone made a wrong judgment based only on surface impressions. It was a quiet ache, a familiar one. He stepped forward in line, trying to shake it off. He wasn't a man who carried bitterness, but he was a man who remembered lessons. Every experience, good or bad, was something he used to grow stronger. Behind him, Officer Bradley was still standing near the wall. The moment had ended, but the weight of it had not. He watched James walk toward the gate, feeling a strange mixture of confusion and regret. Bradley didn't fully understand what had happened yet. He only knew that the man he had doubted had turned out to be someone important, but it wasn't just the title that bothered him. It was how calm James had been through the entire encounter. That calmness said more than any words could. James handed his boarding pass to the agent, received a polite smile, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the soft hum of the engines greeted him. He found his seat near the window, placed his bag carefully in the overhead compartment, and sat down. As he fastened his seatbelt, he let his gaze rest outside the small round window. The sky was now a soft blue fading into purple. Runway lights blinked in neat lines and planes slowly rolled like giant silver birds preparing to fly. He loved this part of travel, the quiet before takeoff. More passengers came in, filling the seats one by one. A middle-aged man sat down beside James, offered a polite nod, and then put on headphones. A young woman across the aisle was texting someone and smiling. A flight attendant walked down the aisle with practiced ease, helping people find their seats. Everything seemed ordinary again, but James could feel the memory of the earlier encounter sitting quietly in the back of his mind, like a book that hadn't been closed yet. Suddenly, before the plane doors were shut, James heard a firm voice near the front. "Excuse me, sir, can you step back out for a moment?" The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made passengers glance up. James turned his head slightly. At the entrance of the plane, 2 airport officers had appeared, and among them, standing just a step behind, was Officer Bradley. James remained seated for a second, steadying his breathing. He didn't know why they had returned, but he didn't want to create any confusion. He calmly unfastened his seatbelt, picked up his boarding pass, and stood up. The passengers around him whispered quietly. It wasn't because of anything dramatic. People were simply curious. It's human nature to pay attention when uniformed officers appear unexpectedly. James walked slowly toward the front, shoulders straight, face calm. He didn't rush. He didn't show fear or frustration. His steps were measured, confident, and quiet. "Is there something you need?" James asked politely as he approached them. The senior officer, a woman with clear, firm eyes, spoke gently. "Sir, we just need to speak with you again for a moment outside." "It will only take a minute," James nodded. "Of course." He followed them off the plane and into a quieter area near the jet bridge. The sound of rolling suitcases faded, replaced by the distant announcements of other flights. The senior officer looked at James's ID again, this time carefully and respectfully. "Mr. Carter," she said in a calm voice, "I want to first apologize for what happened earlier. I understand you were already questioned. There was some confusion, and I want to make sure it's fully cleared before the flight departs." James listened without interrupting. He appreciated the polite tone. He could tell that she was trying to handle things professionally. She continued. "Officer Bradley reported concerns earlier, but after checking everything, it's clear that there was never any issue. I just want to personally confirm and make sure there are no misunderstandings left." James gave a small nod. "I understand. These things happen. I just want to get home." Bradley stood quietly to the side, hands behind his back. His earlier firmness had faded. Now he looked uneasy, as if realizing more fully what had happened. The senior officer gave a small, respectful smile. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Carter. We'll make sure this does not happen again." James appreciated that. He knew she meant it. "Thank you," he replied softly. As he prepared to step back onto the plane, Bradley suddenly spoke. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "Sir, I just want to say I didn't know." James paused. He turned slightly to face him. Their eyes met. Bradley's posture was straight, but his expression carried something unspoken, something between regret and learning. James didn't respond right away. He let a few seconds pass in silence. "That's the thing," he finally said gently. "Most of the time we don't know. That's why it matters how we choose to act." His words were soft, but they stayed in the air like something that wouldn't fade quickly. Bradley lowered his eyes for a moment, realizing that what James said wasn't about rank or authority. It was about something bigger. James walked back to his seat. As he passed down the aisle, passengers glanced at him curiously, but he didn't pay attention to their whispers. He wasn't here to explain himself to strangers. He sat down, buckled his seatbelt again, and looked out the window. The engines began to hum louder as the plane prepared to leave the gate. The flight attendants made their final checks, and the captain's voice came through the speakers, welcoming everyone on board. Slowly, the plane began to move. James rested his hands on his lap, his mind calm but thoughtful. He had handled many complicated situations in his life, but this one carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't about danger or power. It was about perception. It was about the quiet ways assumptions shape people's actions. He thought about the young officers he often trained. He thought about the lessons he gave them, not just about rules or procedures, but about how to treat people with fairness and respect. He often told them, the real strength of an officer isn't in their badge. It's in how they use their judgment. And here he was, living that very lesson, not as a trainer, but as someone on the receiving end of a wrong judgment. As the plane rolled down the runway, James leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment. The gentle vibration of the engines filled the cabin. He thought of his colleagues in Washington. He thought of how stories like this happened to ordinary people every day, people without his title or his influence, people who didn't have the platform to speak up. That thought stayed with him more than anything else. The plane lifted smoothly into the air. The lights of the city below turned into tiny golden dots, slowly fading as the plane climbed higher. James opened his eyes and looked out at the night sky. It was wide and quiet, a perfect contrast to the noise of the world below. He took a deep breath. He had made a choice years ago to lead not just with authority, but with example. Every experience, good or bad, was something he used to make the system better for others. He decided right there that what happened today would not stay as just a memory. It would become a story with purpose. The man sitting next to him removed his headphones and gave him a small smile. "Rough boarding?" he asked kindly. James gave a faint chuckle. "Something like that." The man nodded, not asking any more questions. The flight attendants came around with water and small snacks. James accepted a cup of water and held it in both hands, feeling the coolness against his palms. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a soft calmness filled the cabin. Lights dimmed, conversations lowered, and the sound of engines became like a quiet, steady heartbeat. James looked out the window again, this time not at the airport, not at the ground, but at the endless open night sky. Up here, above everything, the world looked peaceful. No misunderstandings, no rushed judgments, just quiet space. And yet James knew that when the plane landed, the story would continue. Not just for him, but for others who might face similar situations every day. He didn't feel bitterness. What he felt was something stronger, a responsibility to use his voice wisely. Somewhere near the back of the plane, a child laughed softly at a cartoon on a tablet. The sound made James smile. It reminded him of what truly mattered. People, fairness, a world where such simple laughter wouldn't have to exist alongside silent pain. He leaned his head gently against the seat. In the quiet hum of the night flight, he made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't let this be just another passing moment. It would become something that would help others be seen and treated with the respect they deserved. The plane touched down smoothly in Washington, D.C. The landing lights flickered outside the window as the wheels rolled along the runway. James Carter sat still, watching the airport lights flash past like soft, glowing stars. Passengers around him began to reach for their bags, stretch their arms, and talk about their plans. For most of them, it was just another flight. But for James, the journey had been more than just miles in the air. It had been a quiet reminder of something deeper, something that followed many people even when they least expected it. The captain's calm voice came through the speakers, welcoming everyone to Washington. People clapped softly as the plane came to a full stop. A flight attendant smiled at James as she walked down the aisle. "Thank you for flying with us," she said warmly. James returned a polite smile and nodded. As the passengers began to stand, he remained seated for a moment. He liked to let the crowd move first. There was no need to rush. He always believed that patience showed more strength than pushing through a crowd. He adjusted his jacket, checked his watch, and finally stood when the aisle cleared a little. As he stepped out of the plane, cool air touched his face. He walked through the jet bridge calmly, blending in with the flow of people. No one around him knew who he was, and he liked it that way. He didn't need a spotlight. His strength came from quiet action, not from titles or applause. But just as he reached the terminal, he noticed something unexpected. Standing near the arrival gate were several people in formal uniforms. Among them was a woman with a sharp posture and kind eyes, Deputy Director Elena Moore. She was a close colleague of James and one of the few people who had worked alongside him for years. When she saw him, she gave a warm, relieved smile. "James," she said, stepping forward. "Welcome back." "Elena," he greeted calmly. "I didn't expect a welcome committee," she laughed softly. "You've been away for weeks. We thought we'd make sure you got home safe, and," her expression softened slightly, "we heard about what happened at the airport." James tilted his head slightly. "That was fast." "It was on the incident report," she explained. "One of the officers realized who you were a little too late. The story reached the chain of command. I'm sorry that happened." James sighed quietly. "It's all right. I've seen worse things, but yes, it made me think." Elena walked with him toward the exit. Her steps were calm and steady, matching his pace. She had known James long enough to understand when something bothered him, even if he didn't say it directly. "You've dealt with a lot in your career," she said softly. "But I imagine this felt different." He nodded slowly. "It did. Not because of what happened to me, but because I kept thinking about what happens to others who can't speak up. People who don't have my title. People who get misjudged for no real reason." Elena looked at him with quiet respect. She knew what kind of leader he was. He never carried experiences just for himself. He always turned them into something bigger, something that could help others. That was what made him special. As they stepped out of the terminal, a black government vehicle waited at the curb. The driver opened the door. James climbed in and Elena sat beside him. The city lights of Washington painted soft reflections on the car windows as they drove away from the airport. The night was calm, the streets quiet. James leaned his head slightly back against the seat, looking out at the passing lights. His mind wasn't stuck in anger. It was focused, sharp, but also calm. He was thinking, planning, reflecting. "Elena," he said after a moment, "how many training sessions do we have scheduled for next month?" "4 so far," she replied. "Why?" He gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Because I want to add something new to them. Something important." She turned toward him with interest. "What kind of something?" "Not just procedures," he said slowly. "Not just the usual lessons about rules and systems. Something real. Something that reminds officers that the people they approach are not just faces. They're human beings. I want them to understand how quick assumptions can create harm, even when no one raises a hand or raises a voice." Elena nodded slowly. "You want to use what happened?" "Yes," James replied softly. "Not as a story of power, but as a story of awareness." The car passed the familiar landmarks of the city. The shining dome of the Capitol stood tall in the distance. The streets glowed under soft streetlights. It was the city where big decisions were made. And in that quiet ride, James was making one of his own. Not a dramatic one, but one that could touch many lives quietly and powerfully. The next morning, James arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in gentle shades of pink and orange. He liked early mornings. They carried a kind of clarity that the rest of the day often lost. The hallways were quiet, except for a few early staff members greeting him respectfully. He walked straight to the conference room, where a few team members were preparing for the day's briefing. When they saw him, they stood a little straighter, not out of fear but out of respect. James was the kind of leader who earned respect without demanding it. "Morning, everyone," James said calmly, placing his bag on the table. "We've got a lot to talk about." He began the meeting like any other. Updates, schedules, upcoming assignments. but halfway through he paused. His voice became slightly softer but carried more weight. "Something happened at the airport yesterday," he said. The room grew quiet. Everyone knew when James spoke like this, it meant something meaningful was coming. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it reminded me of something I've known for a long time. Sometimes people are misjudged before they even have a chance to speak. His team listened closely. "I want us to do something with that," James continued. "We train people to act fast, but maybe we need to train them to think first, to notice, to understand, to approach with humanity." A young officer raised her hand gently. "Sir," she said respectfully, "are you talking about new training for field officers?" "Yes," James said. "Training that focuses on understanding, not just reacting. Training that reminds officers that the badge doesn't give them the right to judge. It gives them the responsibility to protect, to serve with fairness." Elena, who had joined the meeting, watched with a quiet smile. She could see the shift happening in real time. James wasn't just telling a story, he was building something new. After the meeting, James spent the rest of the morning working on the plan. He drafted notes, spoke with training directors, and outlined a program that focused on one simple but powerful idea: awareness. Not just awareness of surroundings, but of people, of how easy it is to see what we want to see instead of what is true. He decided he wouldn't mention his name in the example. He didn't want it to be about him. Instead, he would present it as a story, an ordinary traveler misjudged at an airport. A story officers could think about, question, and learn from. Days turned into weeks. The new training sessions were launched quietly but powerfully. Officers from different states attended, sitting in neat rows as James stood at the front of the room. His voice was steady, warm, and clear. "Every person you meet has a story," he told them. "Don't assume you already know it before they open their mouth. Don't let your first thought become your only thought." He shared the story of the traveler at the airport. He explained how the situation began with nothing more than an assumption, and how quickly that assumption grew. He talked about how calmness and patience can prevent misunderstandings from becoming something bigger. He reminded them that the strength of a good officer is measured not by how fast they act, but by how wisely they choose to act. The room was quiet as he spoke. Many officers shifted in their seats not out of discomfort, but because they recognized the truth in his words. Some of them thought about moments in their own lives where they had made quick judgments without meaning harm. It was human. But James was asking them to be something more than just human. He was asking them to be aware, responsible, thoughtful. After one session, a young officer approached James. "Sir," he said sincerely, "I didn't realize how easy it is to misunderstand someone without even noticing it. I think this changes how I'll do my job." James smiled softly. "That's all I hope for." Word of the program began to spread quietly through different departments. It wasn't a loud campaign. It didn't make headlines. But it began to grow like a calm ripple on water. Quiet, steady, reaching further than anyone expected. At night, James often walked by the reflecting pool near his office, where the soft water mirrored the city lights. He would stand there with his hands in his pockets, breathing in the cool air and thinking. The world was big. Problems were complex. Change was never instant. But he believed deeply in the power of small, honest actions. The misunderstanding at the airport had started with nothing more than a glance. A simple moment. But it had ended up planting the seed for something much bigger. A movement toward more thoughtful, fair, and aware policing. James didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who believed in doing what was right. And sometimes doing what's right begins with something quiet. A conversation, a lesson, a choice. That night, as the lights reflected on the water, James Carter stood quietly and thought of all the people who, like him, had been misunderstood. He made a silent promise that he would keep using his. Months passed quietly after the day at the airport, but the story didn't disappear. It grew, not like a loud headline, but like a seed planted in the ground, slowly turning into something strong. James Carter returned to his usual schedule. He led meetings, oversaw operations, and guided his team with the calm leadership that had earned him deep respect over the years. But something in him had shifted. What happened that day stayed with him like a soft echo, reminding him why he did this work, not just for himself, but for the people who came after him. The training program he had started began to spread beyond his own department. Other agencies heard about it, not because of official announcements, but because officers who attended told others. They said the sessions were different. They said it wasn't just about rules and checklists. It was about understanding people, about slowing down enough to see the human being in front of you before making assumptions. One morning, James was reviewing some reports in his office when Elena walked in. She placed a folder on his desk and smiled. "You should see this," she said. James opened the folder and began to read. Inside were letters from officers across the country. Not official reports, personal letters. Some were typed, some written by hand. Many were short, but every single one carried something honest. One letter said, "I didn't realize how my first thoughts shape my actions. After your session, I've started to listen more, not just look." Another said, "I used to think awareness training was just another box to check, but your story changed how I see people. It made me pause before judging." James read them slowly, one by one. He wasn't someone who liked attention, but reading those words filled his chest with a quiet sense of purpose. He didn't need applause. Just knowing that something was changing, something real, was enough. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window at the early sunlight touching the city. "Elena," he said softly, "this is why it matters." She smiled. "Yes, it really does, but that wasn't the only impact." Months later, James was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. He wasn't a man who loved the stage or the spotlight, but Elena gently encouraged him. "James," she said one afternoon, "you don't need to be loud. You just need to be honest. That's what people listen to." He agreed. The conference hall was large, filled with officers, leaders, and policymakers from across the country. Some wore uniforms. Others wore suits. Cameras flashed softly as people took their seats. James stepped onto the stage quietly, not with a grand gesture, but with the calm, steady walk that was his signature. He looked out at the crowd. So many faces, so many different stories. He held the microphone loosely, not gripping it like a tool, but holding it like he would hold a conversation with a friend. "I'm not here to talk about power," he began. "I'm here to talk about awareness, about the moments that shape the way we treat people." The room was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that came when people truly wanted to listen. He told them the story, not naming himself, not naming the officer, not adding unnecessary details. Just the story of a traveler who was misjudged at an airport. A story that began with a glance and a simple assumption. A story that could have ended badly but instead turned into a lesson. "I've worked in law enforcement for many years," James said. "I've seen how small moments can shape big outcomes. And I've learned that how we act in those small moments is what defines us, not just as officers, but as human beings." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Every person you meet carries a story. You don't know it. You don't need to know it right away. But you owe them respect before judgment. You owe them space before assumption." Heads nodded quietly across the room. Some people wrote notes. Others just sat still reflecting. James continued, his voice steady and clear. "We train for many things, how to move, how to act, how to respond. But we also need to train how to see, how to notice without judging, how to listen without deciding before someone speaks. If we can learn that, we can build more trust, not just authority." When he finished, the room didn't erupt into loud applause. Instead, something more powerful happened. It was quiet for a few seconds, a silence full of thought, and then people began to stand. One by one. It wasn't about cheering. It was about respect. A quiet, honest respect. James nodded politely, then stepped down from the stage. He didn't linger. He didn't seek attention. He simply walked out with the same calm grace he always carried. After the conference, many officers approached him in the hallway. Some shook his hand. Some just said thank you. One young officer, probably in his early 20s, looked especially moved. "Sir," the young man said softly, "I want to be the kind of officer who listens first. Thank you for reminding me why I started this job." James smiled warmly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's where it begins," he said, "with listening." As the weeks turned into months, change happened slowly, but it was happening. More departments requested the training program. It became part of conversations about improving community relationships. The story of the traveler spread quietly. Some knew it was James, many didn't, and that didn't matter to him. What mattered was that the message was working. In his personal life, James found more moments of peace. He visited his family more often. He attended his niece's school play, just like he promised months before. When he walked through the crowded school hall, people smiled at him, not knowing his title or position. They just saw a kind, calm man with a warm smile. His sister noticed something in him one evening at dinner. "You seem lighter," she said gently. James chuckled softly. "Maybe I finally learned how to let heavy things become useful." She tilted her head. "You always turn difficult things into lessons." James shrugged with a quiet smile. "It's the only way to make them mean something." Meanwhile, Officer Bradley, the man who had once made the wrong judgment at the airport, was also changing. After that day, he requested to join the awareness training program himself. He didn't make excuses for what happened. Instead, he wanted to learn. Slowly, he became one of the strongest advocates for the program at his own department. Months later, he wrote James a short letter. It simply said, "That day changed how I see everything. I'm grateful it happened with someone like you. Thank you for turning a mistake into a lesson." James read the letter quietly and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't need to tell anyone about it. It was enough for him to know that growth had come from a moment that could have gone another way. Years later, the program became a standard part of training for many agencies. New recruits learned the story of the traveler in their very first weeks. They didn't know the traveler's name. They didn't need to. The story itself was the teacher. For James, the moment at the airport never became a burden. It became a legacy, not of titles or medals, but of humanity, patience, and the quiet power of understanding. One evening, long after he retired, James sat on a park bench not far from where the planes flew overhead. He watched families walking by, children laughing, people heading to flights, some waving goodbye, others greeting loved ones with open arms. Airports no longer reminded him of misunderstanding. They reminded him of how one moment of unfairness had bloomed into something good. He leaned back, breathing in the cool evening air, and smiled softly to himself. He thought of all the young officers learning to see the world with more open eyes. He thought of all the travelers who would meet someone a little more patient, a little more kind because of that one day. He had spent his life serving the law. But the part he was proudest of was not the badge, not the rank, not the awards. It was the quiet, invisible change he helped create. The world outside would never know the whole story. They didn't need to. What mattered was that people would feel its ripple in small ways. In kind words. In fair treatment, in better choices. As the night sky deepened and a plane flew above, James Carter watched its lights fade into the stars. His heart felt full, not because he had fought a big battle, but because he had chosen a quiet, meaningful path. And sometimes quiet change is the strongest kind.